I've got a question for you. And the answer depends, at least partly, on the primary perspective you take, either as an audience member or a maker, when you think about how to answer it. It centers around effort in art making and to what degree the visibility of that effort affects how we connect to the work, both as the artist and as a viewer. Now, the answer is entirely subjective, but it's something that I'd like to continue to explore in multiple conversations over time. But before we get to that, we're talking about culling our creativity, letting go of some of the distractions, both literal and metaphorical, and keeping and really leaning into the things that continue to challenge and inspire us to make. I'm Jeffrey Sidoris. I'm talking to John Wilkening, and this is In Between. What does 2020 look like for you creatively? Do you have an agenda? Are you still kind of winging it? What do you see happening?
Well, considering most of my life winging it has been my strategy. to say that would change would be not looking at the current trend.
Right.
Part of my goal over the next year is to really cull a lot of the stuff that I've accumulated creatively that are distracting.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's just one of those where like I have extra cameras, I have extra this, I have extra that, and like really try to hone in on like what creatively makes me happy,
right?
That I just want to do for the sake of doing it.
Is it a need versus want, or is it, how are you making that distinction between what you want to keep, what you want to get rid of, both in terms of the physical stuff and the process that sort of dictates how that stuff gets used?
To be honest, I don't know yet.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that is work in progress, but
right.
Like part of me hates the hype around that the Japanese art of tidying up, but there's
right.
but there's
you're much more a kintsugi kind of guy.
It's one of those where it's like my Anna always hates the chaos that I sort of live in, and she's like you could have your office, but the rest of the house is mine. So you open my office door and it looks like another person inhabited that part of the house.
Right.
But like I resonate and love the idea of like, does this bring me joy?
Mm-hmm.
And
are you able to answer those questions?
I think so.
Yeah.
At least somewhat. You know, there's definitely like I know the reasons things were purchased, and like I understand the desires. Like what drove those purchases.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it was also, especially because I shoot with film, so much of it was like almost like this fear that things are going away.
Right.
And thankfully a lot of, yes, they're going away to some extent, but like that whole market has sort of stabilized to extent.
Sure. I mean, Kodak's not selling 3 million feet of film a year, but they're bringing back film, and there arguably hasn't been a better time in the last 20 years to be a film photographer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Ilford released new film.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the film companies that are out there are sort of figuring out what their new way of selling film is going to look like, and then figuring out how to make that profitable for them, which is encouraging. You know, it may be that the films that I like are a little more expensive than they have been in the past, but the fact that they're still available,
right, and not significantly so, to be honest. I mean, I'm kind of surprised that film hasn't increased in price more than it has.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, especially if you ask people, say, start of the last decade,
Mm-hmm.
where do you think film would be? Most people would be like, why would anyone shoot with film?
Right. Right.
You know, and I mean, you may still be asking that question, but but the that whole argument of shoot film or not shoot film, like to me, that's one of those like just find out what clicks with you and
Mm-hmm.
make the best images you can. But there's definitely I have a nice stock. Like if I didn't buy any more film, I could probably shoot for a long time,
Right.
you know. And so it's one of those things where it's like, do I really need that? You know, and sort of just being like look at the resources that I have, and instead of going, it'd be nice to have X or Y, go, what can I create with this?
Right. Does it give you a renewed sort of sense of purpose? Sounds wrong, but I think you'll know what I
Yeah,
mean by it.
yeah, it's a renewed sense of curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Probably
Yeah,
be,
maybe that's a better way to put it. Yeah, yeah,
like to me, the creative pursuits are very much like almost like Alice in Wonderland type thing, where you're walking along and you just try to find the next rabbit hole. And sometimes you look at a rabbit hole and jump into it, and other times you trip and fall into
and
it.
fall into it face first.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know,
but I mean that being said, sometimes when you know pull the dirt and weeds out of your mouth and look around, you go, well, wait a minute, I can do something here.
yeah,
I
yeah,
can do something with this.
and I think I could look back at my life and say I don't think I've ever regretted falling into the rabbit hole
Mm-hmm.
in hindsight. Like, there definitely been times where you're like, why did I fall into this rabbit hole?
Right.
Because that rabbit hole looks a lot cooler.
There's a lot made of intent and purpose in making, but I tend to think that you can back into that and find intent and purpose that you didn't look for and still create compelling and satisfying work.
Yeah, no, I would tend to argue that the people who are most passionate about a pursuit are more passionate now than when they originally started the pursuit.
Mm,
Because what happens is along the way, if you're continuing to do something, that means there's something, it's offering something to you.
right.
And the farther you get into something, the more the subtleties are apparent, the more the little things that drive you. Like, I think if you're the sort of peak passion to start a project, it will fail.
Mm,
And that what happens is that passion is almost like the reward for doing something long enough.
mm-hmm.
Like where you're like, I really like this because now I'm now now this is the aspect of it that's intriguing me or
Right.
sort
Right.
of
Yeah,
digging into.
it's almost like to use kind of where you went earlier. Passion is the reward for curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if you go into it, like you say, peaking, there are fewer directions to go in. There are fewer pivot points, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And like to me, it it probably best if you and that most analogous to like a relationship. Like when you first you know like meet someone new, and there's the butterflies, like all that sort of feeling. But like that is almost like one shallow aspect of what is broadly defined as love.
Mm-hmm.
And that the longer you're with somebody, in a weird way, that disappears and is replaced by something deeper, but it also harder to quantify. And to where you know I could tell my the I could tell what mood my wife is by how she says the word fine.
Right. Right.
Like where it's like,
Fine, John. I'm
yeah,
fine.
yeah. It's like,
Okay.
yeah,
You know that room we talked about earlier? I'll be in there.
yeah, exactly. and, and and I think a lot of people, like when you get into photography, that first image that sort of drags you under, if you want to say,
Mm-hmm.
you look at that image a couple of years later and you're like, why was that?
Yeah. Why was that the one? Yeah.
Like you're like, there's a million things wrong with this, but that was the trigger. That was
Mm-hmm.
the thing that like launched this journey that you're on.
Right.
And so like I hesitate to like sort of, follow your passions. No, just follow your curiosities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I find what you're curious about is more deeply tied to what moves you creatively. And in a weird way, whatever drives that curiosity is more in line with you as a person than quote unquote passion or excitement.
How do you see that changing? Because this is interesting. And as we're talking about this, I'm looking at the text I sent you this morning about
Mhm.
what Adrian and I have been talking about, and it changes. I think your expectations around what you produce change, and your expectations about how that work is seen or experienced from the
Yeah.
audience perspective, and how
Mhm.
you relate to those things that's another variable entirely that we don't talk about it a lot, to
No,
my knowledge anyway.
no. I find like I resonated with the question was more or less, you know, how does the appearance of difficulty in the work sort of I'm pulling up the message right now. What's the role slash importance of effort to different makers,
Right.
given the impression of something being effortless versus demonstrating visual effort?
Right.
And like I resonated with that question a lot because so much of my work is because it's messy has the appearance of being effortless,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way that the way I feel that has in some ways it will at first diminish the work to a new viewer, as in it's easier for someone to just look at it the same way you would look at a Jackson Pollock painting and go, I could do that.
Yeah. Yeah. My kid could do
Yeah. You're like, I've literally done that with a brush trying to clean it in my basement. Like, that.
Next time, put canvas down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But then you sit there and you stare at it and you're like, but I feel differently about that than I do my kids' paint.
Right.
And I think it's something where like you see certain images. Crutzen's a perfect example. You look at a Crutzen's image, and especially every photographer goes, "How did he do this?" Because you're like, there's 14 different light sources. There's
Right.
like
Right.
the color palette is immaculate. Like it feels like there's not a hair misplaced in the entire frame.
But it had to be made.
Mm-hmm.
Like you, at least when I look at those things, when I look at those types of photographs, I come away going, there's a respect there because this is a world that was created.
Correct.
And everything is there because Gregory wanted it there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the photos that Adrian and I were talking about was, do you remember a few years back, Spencer Murphy had that shot in Taylor Wessing of the jockey, the female jockey right after right after a race.
Oh yeah.
And that shot to me, and absolutely no disrespect to Spencer Murphy. In fact, just the opposite. that shot to me looked absolutely effortless. That shot looked as if it just spontaneously happened. But I know that there was craft there. I know that there was intent there. I know that there was a history of thousands of photographs that he had taken before it that led to that moment. But it feels effortless is the word I keep coming back to.
I think especially with people are interesting to photograph because we've all done it to some extent. Especially now in the smartphone era. And we've all are familiar with the would have been a great picture, but someone is blinking. Or like, and like we almost subconsciously understand what difficult creatures humans are to work with. And so like an image like that, yeah, and in one respect we look at it and go, that's just a right place at the right time. You know, you have a lighting setup that is your go-to that you've done a million times. Boom, there you go. But it definitely is one of those where like you do it enough and you're like, that could be a once in a lifetime image.
Yeah, a 500th of a second either side of that, and it's arguably completely different.
Exactly, because there's an intangible there that is almost impossible to quantify, but everyone sort of knows it. Or could feel it, which makes it fascinating from like a creative standpoint.
Right. And I wonder if that, I mean, never having spoken to Spencer Murphy, I'd love to talk to him, but do you still feel that way 1,000 portraits into your career, 5,000 portraits into your career? Are you still able to see and accept where skill and spontaneity collide?
Yeah, no, that is an interesting. Yeah. Do you think when he was setting up his camera, do you think that was the portrait he had in mind? Do you think he was surprised by that image? And
I don't know.
I know that's an impossible question.
It's an impossible
for you to answer.
I hope so. I hope that when that roll or that sheet, I don't even know if it was shot on sheet film or roll film, nor does it really matter. But when that was pulled out of the developer or when that was contact printed, I hope that there was a, wow, okay, that kind of a response. I hope that that's what happened. It's sort of like the Charles Mingus quote about making the simple complicated is common, but making the complicated simple, that's creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those where you would love to see the rest of that contact sheet.
Right.
Because there's going to be some garbage images on there.
Well, yeah. In when I talked to Keatley, what was it, a month ago or so now, we were talking about that contact sheet of, that famous shot of Jim Morrison where he's got, the no shirt and the necklace and his arms kind of outstretched. Like every other shot on that contact sheet was just okay.
Yeah.
But there was that one moment where it all sort of either came into focus or faded away, depending on how you see that. And now we have this photograph forever.
Yeah. And like to bring it to like you in terms of like, let's put it this way. Your paintings always surprise me because I can't do that.
I can't do it either.
That's more of an effort thing. but you have a self-deprecating almost like I just add stuff and see where it goes about it.
Yeah.
And to me, it looks like a magic trick.
Well, thank you. I mean, I appreciate that. I don't know if I agree with you, but should the effort be visible in art, in photography? Should we know who took the photograph, who made the painting, or is it enough to just connect with the work? And does that evolve over time as both an audience member and as a maker? Are we more or less concerned with the who as an audience, and are we more or less concerned with who knows that we made it as a maker? I mean, these are things that I kind of want to talk about with a variety of different types of makers and see where they land on it, because it's fascinating to me. I could name a half a dozen pictures that I can tell you in great detail the context and what's in the frame, but I have no idea who made the picture. Nor do I, if I'm being honest, nor do I really care, because I just connect with the work. Same with paintings. There are a lot of painters that I look at the work and I see it and I go, wow, that's really great, or, whatever it is. And the who is sometimes, maybe even often, irrelevant compared to the what and how I connect with a piece of work. And I'd love to talk about that and unpack that with a variety of different, both audience members and makers for that matter, to see kind of how that has evolved over time.
Yeah, I think that really depends on the subject matters. Like I'm trying to think of photographs and the photographer and like trying to like it almost like Rolodex. Does this add to it?
Right.
And like I'm not sure why this was the first one that popped in my head, but like Vivian Mayer's work.
Mm-hmm.
I gained a better appreciation of the work when I look at it from the standpoint of she's almost like a forgotten member of society. Let's put it that way, where she's a nanny. She lives this sort of like she takes care of this wealthy family's child, and she just lives and operates on the outskirts of society. But her camera is her way of observing society that's operating around it.
How does knowing that affect how you experience the work? Because it sounds like it does have an effect on maybe not how you experience it, but what you take away from it.
I guess it's one of those where like I look at it and in some ways it imbues the work with a certain feeling significance that goes maybe above and beyond the images of in and of themselves. The image can be broken down into your sort of classic who, what, where, when, why, or what's in the image, but like that, knowing that you look at her body of work and you get this almost reflective look back at Mayer and how she feels she's looking at the world from.
Mm-hmm.
And then with that comes the context of like, this is how she feels when she's creating the work. And then this is why this is the images that responded to her enough that she took the picture.
Right.
And the beauty of it is that whole feeling I'm feeling when I look at the work doesn't necessarily have to be there per se. It's just how I feel almost the work.
Mm-hmm. Do you get a different, and I know I'm going to butcher this, but do you get a different feeling around the work looking at somebody like Mayer's work, where I think we can pretty safely assume that she never intended that work to be seen by the public?
Correct.
Versus somebody like Winogrand. Well, Winogrand's an interesting example too, because Winogrand, there are apparently thousands of frames that have still yet to be developed.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Saul Leiter is a better choice, or Fred Herzog, another sort of documentarian, but a documentarian for whom getting the work in front of an audience was a part of the work.
Mm.
Do you see those do you experience those differently?
Yeah, like I was trying to think as you were framing the question. I was trying to think of any like anyone who'd be the counterpoint to that.
Mm-hmm.
And the name that pops in my head is Robert Frank, and his America series.
Sure. That was a very obvious commentary and a very obvious sort of, I'm going to release this body of work as a commentary about the world around me.
Correct.
Yeah.
But that work for me literally does nothing to tell me who Robert Frank was.
Why is that?
I don't know.
You see less of the maker's hand there than you do in somebody like Vivian Mayer.
Correct.
Why is
Well,
that? Is it? Why do you think
and
that is?
let's highlight another photographer, maybe like Nan Golding's work.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of her work feels like a means of for her to almost process herself
Yeah,
through.
yeah, yeah. It took me a while to get to a place where I could appreciate her work.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't get past the initial, not maybe shock of the subject matter to get to where that subject matter came from, or what was based on at least what I had read and watched, what was driving that subject matter, why she needed to make those pictures.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder how that has changed for her. Does she? And this is what I find fascinating: is does that change over time? Does she feel the need to be seen in her pictures?
Mm.
Not physically, I mean, but her
Yeah.
does her presence need to be seen in those photographs, or is it enough that we find them compelling and they resonate with us on some personal level without tying it to her on a personal level? And that's what I'd love to talk to different artists and makers and things like that about.
Yeah. No, I think that's like, I mean, that might be one, talk about big question. That
Yeah.
might be you one of the bigger ones. But like, do you feel yourself in your own work?
No.
Because
No.
I would respond the same way.
Yeah. I've been I've been trying to evaluate my relationship to the work that I make. And I think that across the board, I tend to not, and this is just the way I see it at the moment, and I may be way off base, but I don't see myself as a maker as much as I see myself as an assembler. I assemble, I pull different elements and I assemble them in a way that is either aesthetically pleasing or emotionally compelling for me.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's no difference. Maybe I'm splitting hairs. Maybe this is a game of semantics that I'm playing with myself, so I don't have to call myself an artist or something. I don't know. But I feel like the bulk of my making, if you will, is assembling things that fit together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna ask how you saw the value judgment differently between the two. Like, how do you value those? Would you if you saw someone's work that was more assembly than creation?
I don't know that
Uh,
there's a I don't know how I would respond to that. I actually don't know how to respond to that. I'm not saying that there's no value in what I do. I just see I see what I make as assembling things that already exist in a way that hasn't been seen. I'm not
mm-hmm.
creating from nothing. Whereas somebody like, I don't know, a figurative painter or a writer creates from a blank page, from a blank canvas. Yes, I start with a blank canvas, but more often than not, I start with existing materials and I start assembling and then adding on top of it, or pulling through it, or I don't know. It's hard to explain, and I'm like I said, it's still uh, not very solid in my head. I just feel like I'm in this period of sort of relearning my own role in the creative process, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, no, I'd say that. I would sort of argue with you that there that people create out of nothing.
How do you mean?
I think that we we all, when we create something, we all bring a certain level of found objects and inspiration and sort of past experience to the table. The only difference is your work, you can literally see the pieces. Like you instead of going, I'm gonna paint my idea of a crow. You're like, I just found a picture of a crow and put it on there.
Yeah. Or hopefully took a picture of a crow.
Oh, one of the other. Yeah, yeah. but you see what I mean?
Dust off these cameras and take them out in the wild every once in a while.
But my work basically comes from looking at what I did and looking at other photographers and going, how can I do that with the equipment I have?
Mm-hmm.
I end up in a different spot than they do, but I didn't start from nothing.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Every musician, when they're writing a song, has thousands of the songs from the past roaming through their head.
Sure.
And the crazy part is your brain goes, what about this riff? And you have no idea where that came from. And then years later, you're hearing a song and you're like, oh
yeah. Yeah. Or you get a letter in the mail saying, hey, guess what?
Yeah.
You know that chord progression that you, air quotes, came up with?
I'm trying to remember that whole Vanilla Ice defense.
Right. Oh, what didn't they added an extra beat or something? It was
they added a symbol at the end.
Yeah, it's like dun 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 dun. Like,
exactly.
Oh yeah, that's really different. Yeah, no, it's good. That's good.
Oh, but I think there's this weird pressure that we put on creating when we define it as creating something new out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to looking at it as adding two things that other people hadn't considered putting together.
Mm-hmm.
Or different elements, or looking at things different way. I think the reason I think I mentioned this in a conversation with you in the past about one of the key personality traits that creative people are almost defined by is openness. Meaning they're open to new experiences, new ideas, new places, all that. And part of that comes out of creative people are almost receivers for all these things that surround them. And your brain just almost constantly catalogs and throws out things that it doesn't find, useful or entertaining or whatever. And then it's constantly going, oh, I might find some purpose for that idea later.
Right. Where can I put this?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I think I'm in terms of the things that I do make, I think I'm getting better about recognizing the value in that process. The value in having boxes and boxes full of all this crap, but being able to sort of synthesize it or combine it into something maybe not wholly unique, but iterative enough that it's different than the source material.
Yeah, and that's honestly 90% of the creative game is trying to take something and change it to something new.
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing when it's something new.
Right. That's I think that is one of the hardest parts, is that sort of, you can, starting is arguably easier, but when to stop, when to be able to look at that thing, whatever that thing is, whether it's a song or a screenplay or a novel or a photograph or a painting, that's done. That says what I want it to say.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of those that comes via experience and just a continual doing, because I don't think those decisions happen, or I don't think you make the good decisions when you start out in terms of when it's done.
Mm-hmm.
That's why every photographer, when they start out, loves the clarity slider. And then you look back and you're like, oof, what was I doing?
Yeah. So when you, and I'm making a huge assumption here, that you have put down the pinhole camera, if not for good, for a while. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
What was driving, what drove the decision to stop that body of work? Was there too much of you in it? Was there not enough of you in it? How did you get to that point where you went, nope, this is done. I've said all I need to say or can say, and maybe clarify, which was it? Can or should or where did that fall?
See, when I look at my work, I don't see myself in the work.
Did you ever?
No. But what that work represents is a visual puzzle. And this is one of the realizations that I've come to over this last year, is that I am driven more by trying to solve a problem or solve a puzzle than I am by having something internally that needs to be said, that needs to get out. Or in that, I feel that there's certain artists that for whatever's in them has to come out, and that the work happens to be the vehicle that it chooses to exit.
Right. That was the medium for the message, but the message was the most important thing.
Correct.
Yeah. Not you, though.
Yeah, no. And it's weird because in some ways I've judged myself for that, from a standpoint of not for feeling less like a true artist.
Explain. When you stopped, you mean?
No, just in
or in general.
No, just in general.
Mm-hmm.
This is it, because it's one of those things when you look at certain artists that are creating work that are like a direct link to who they are as human being, and sort of they're like, you hear it often where you're like, it feels like the work was in them and just needed to get out.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't see your work that way. It was more was it a visual puzzle that you were trying to solve?
Yeah, it was almost like a math problem. Where I had this forgotten piece of equipment and I had almost an image that I wanted to create with that piece of equipment. And it was in some ways the worst the worst possible equipment to choose to try to produce those images.
Mm-hmm.
And it became a game of like, how do I take this thing that I shouldn't be able to do this with and let me learn everything I can about this process to then be able to manipulate it in such a way that this is not what other people do with this piece of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in some ways purposely making this as cold as cold
Right.
cold a process as I
Right.
can.
Right.
But like my curiosity was in, how do I make this happen with this thing that shouldn't be able to do this?
Right. When you got to that point, when you, and I'm going to simplify this, when you were able to solve the equation or when you were able to answer the question, was there a period of time where you kept on hoping that maybe a new problem or question would surface, or
Mm-hmm.
there was? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's and then what happened was I reached the end of what I could do with the camera
Mm-hmm.
in terms of creating
With that particular camera.
with
Yeah.
that particular
Yeah.
camera. And then I basically was like, can I basically use a regular camera to do the same thing? And that was a whole lot easier to do because it was more easily suited for what I wanted to do.
Right. I can't imagine it was as satisfying though, because it was more easily suited for you.
It correct, and which is why it it didn't last nearly as long.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of I reached a point where it was like I had I'd figured out this problem, and so my curiosity for that had, if you want to say, diminished.
Sure. Kind of run its course.
And then I'm left with this sort of, what is the problem I want to solve or tackle?
Mm-hmm.
And creatively speaking, I haven't really answered that.
Right.
And I'm still drawn to take photographs.
Mm-hmm.
It's just I don't know what I want to do with that. And so like I feel weird about it because I don't have the, it was so much easier when I had a day off because I knew exactly what I was going to do,
Mm-hmm.
and so I could just get up and start working on it. It's so much harder when you're like, I could do a million things.
Right. Right.
I don't know what I want to do.
If you didn't see, because you said that you didn't really see you in the work.
Mm-hmm.
How does that translate to what you want or maybe even need an audience to get from that work? If they're not seeing you, and if you're not seeing you, what is the connection from the audience's perspective to that work, or what did you want that connection to be?
Mm-hmm. My goal when someone looked at my work is I wanted to in some ways challenge the way people viewed the world around them. And in the way of, we so much of what we look at the world as being this solid, static, set in stone thing. And by creating this like blurry, messy thing.
Almost fluid.
Oh yeah, almost fluid.
Yeah.
What it did is it it took the things that were recognizable and made them not recognizable. It basically, objects that are solid like a bus become fluid,
Mm-hmm.
and you could see through them. You know, human beings become almost trails or almost like memories where you see like the outline but you can't make out the features.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so much of like, I sort of I was on this was a number of years ago I was talking to a guy on his podcast about my work, and I framed it in that because I grew up all over the world, I saw different versions of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like I still remember the day when I think I was like 11 or 12, somewhere in that range, and coming back from India, and I walked into my first American's grocery store and being blown away.
Right.
Like that feeling of just being like, holy, look at this thing.
So,
Like,
okay. So, okay. Is your work then, or was that work? And maybe I'm way off base. A way of dealing with, or maybe not dealing with is the wrong word. Maybe a way of presenting that sort of blur of childhood and adolescent travel, where there wasn't any. I mean, yes, things were recognizable as people and buildings and buses and things like that, but the detail was lost because you were sort of always in motion yourself.
maybe.
Or am I just reaching for something poetic because I want to put a bow on it?
The beauty of it is that if I did say that,
mm-hmm.
it's one of those where I said it despite myself rather than because like,
mm-hmm.
I could look back at my work and then almost write an artist statement of it.
Sure.
But I was more focused on actually getting just a regular image that I wasn't paying attention to why I was doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like
you'd be backing into an artist statement for sure.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And which is why I've always struggled with those types of things.
Are you suspect of any of them because your experience is so different in terms of making the work, or are there statements that you've read that you go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That I can believe that, I can buy off on that, or do they all sound like sort of after the fact to you because that's been your experience in making your own work?
I know I've talked with enough artists to know that there are people who 100% reflect the artist statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's definitely some that you read and you're like, that one's suspect.
I have questions.
yeah. They're but like, I've also, it's one of those like, I've known enough creative people to understand that like we're all in some ways wired slightly different, which is why the work, you could take the same subject matter and come up with wildly different things.
Right.
That's.
And I think you and I both know plenty of people, maybe some of the same people, for whom thinking about the why of the work is really secondary to just doing the work.
Agreed.
It's not that they're on autopilot, but there's not a sense of, okay, I need to go out and make this because I'm trying to say this, and this needs to tie back to this. They just make, and then almost look at the body that's been created and go, oh, well, you know what? Here's what's happening. There's this thread running through this whole thing that I didn't see at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And, and like sort of back to the idea where it's like, I know I'm different than other people, but I know also everybody is different than everybody.
Right.
So it,
It's a revelation, John.
I know. Welcome to Deep Thoughts with
That's
Jack
right. I know I'm different. It's an Andy Dwyer moment, right?
Yeah.
I'm different, but I feel like everybody's also different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's I know.
And scene, people.
And you've had this feeling where you talk long enough on a podcast where you have that you almost go like zoom third party person out, and you're
Right.
like, did you just really say that? With a straight face.
I'm gonna insert a little
straight
record
face.
scratch right here. Just
Yeah. So like it's one of those where like I know in order to keep on producing work that I have to in some ways just accept who I am
mm-hmm.
and then work within that confine, as opposed to attempting to create from someone else's structure
Mm-hmm.
or idea.
Do you have any idea what that looks like circa early 2020?
No.
Yeah.
And that's the, if you want to say, a bow on my struggles right
mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for, I don't know, 3-4 years, I had an identity. I had a thing.
Right.
I could sum myself up nicely into this box.
Sure. And the work reflected that summary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And like, it was funny, like, in a weird, not to toot my own horn kind of way, but like I was looking over my work. For some reason I had to go into my photographic files, and I was just looking at some of the work I produced at the very end of some of my projects, and I was like, I resonate with a lot of what I produced during that thread.
More so now than when you were producing it?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And in some ways, my struggle to create might have been less to do with the work I was creating and more just from me as a creator.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not sure how that solves anything, but like that realization benefits me. But like it was one of those where it was like it was definitely a nice feeling to look back and go, I'm proud of that. I'm happy with that. Like,
I would imagine it sets the stage for what comes next, sort of on the back of that pride that I can do this. I can make something that is still compelling to me a couple years on, not just at the time of making.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, and like part of that also comes from like all I need to do is find the puzzle that I want to solve.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that you actively have to seek that out, or does it work better when it finds you, when it sort of drops into your lap?
I think that I tend to find them better when I'm looking for a puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's not that I need to be open for the puzzle to hit me in the face.
Sure.
Not that I'm actively looking for the puzzle. Like I never seem to be like, okay, I'm going to look for the puzzle here and I find it.
Right.
It's more
just a general openness, I think, for you.
Yeah.
And for a while, I mean, to be fair, you kind of weren't. You needed to kind of take a break from that for a bit. Yes.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. Well, welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the mud, John. Stay tuned, folks.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah.
I feel like I would like to document more of it. I feel like I would like, and maybe we can find a balance where we're recording these sort of progress reports or that's the wrong way to put it, but because there probably won't be progress for a while. But that we're having these conversations and finding a rhythm to share and work through some of it, not just with each other, but with an audience who may be experiencing similar or, for that matter, completely different realities.
Yeah, no, I think, in the past you've mentioned #behind the scenes, wanting to do a more regular show. And I think I would enjoy regularly chatting with you because it's fun to play idea tennis with you.
Well, thank you. And I agree. And I always come away energized. It may not lead anywhere because it doesn't have to, but it renews or sort of engages the desire to go looking.
Yeah.
And I think if that were to be my hope is that in recording and sharing that it would do the same for other people. That these touch bases and people could feel feel like they can write in and ask questions or perhaps even be a part of the discussions moving forward and realize sort of that we're all working through these things.
Yeah, I think the more real conversations about the struggle of creating, the better it is for creators as a whole.
And that, I mean, I know that word struggle gets used and perhaps overused, and sometimes it can feel like a struggle. Sometimes it can just feel like a challenge. And I don't want to get stuck on the semantics of it. Whatever you feel the need to call it, and wherever you're at, let's just see where we can go with it. Let's just see where we can support and encourage and challenge each other in doing this stuff, because I think that's important too.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that statement.
Subscribe to In Between in your favorite podcast app. You can also get every episode of In Between, as well as my other shows, Iterations and Process Driven, all in one feed by subscribing to Jeffrey Sidoris Everything. If you're enjoying the show, and I hope you are, I'd love it if you'd consider leaving a review or a rating on iTunes or sharing it on social media. You can connect with me on Instagram and Twitter at Jeffrey Sidoris, that's JeffreySaddoris, or on my website at jeffreysidoris.com. If you've got questions or feedback or maybe an interesting story to share, email me at talkback@jeffreysidoris.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can find John on Instagram at John Wilkening. That's JONWILKENING, or by visiting his website at johnwilkening.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you being here, and we will talk to you on the next one. On the other side, I could be completely full of shit.
The wonderful coin of being a human being.
As Adrian says, it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah, no. It's one of those where one side of the coin says like self-validation, and the other side says piece of shit. And
yeah. What did we get today?